This phenomenon probably limited the achievements of mankind more than anything else. When this thing infects us, we stop growing, stop learning, we rot. We turn off or tune out the ability to receive inspiration because we already know all there is to know.
Welcome to the Bankless by Design podcast, where we rethink money, ditch the system, and rediscover what it means to truly thrive well. I'm Tricia Miller, mom of 7, financial coach, and founder of ThriveWell. Around here, we believe wealth is more than numbers. It's about freedom, stewardship, and building a legacy that lasts. If you're ready to challenge the norm and take back control of your financial life, you're in the right place.
Hello and welcome to the Bankless by Design podcast. My name is Tricia Miller and I'm here with my son Jonathan, and we're continuing through our Becoming Your Own Banker series. And in this series, we are walking through Nelson Nash's foundational text for the infinite banking concept. Today, we're nearing the end of part 2, the human problems, and we're looking at what Nelson calls the arrival syndrome. And this is the one that says, we already know all that there is to know. So essentially, it's the problem of pride. One of the deadly sins, often considered the root of all other sins. Perhaps it is the one that we are the most blind to, but this is essentially what we're going to get into and how it actually affects us when it comes to the infinite banking concept. So, Jonathan, let's go ahead and start on page 34 in the 5th edition, right at the very top. If you would, just read that very first paragraph to introduce this human problem for us.
Absolutely. The arrival syndrome. Now we turn our attention to probably the most devastating matter that we have examined thus far. I call it the arrival syndrome. This phenomenon probably limited the achievements of mankind more than anything else. When this thing infects us, we stop growing, stop learning, we rot. We turn off or tune out the ability to receive inspiration because we already know all there is to know. So he calls it, Mom, the most devastating one so far. So even more so than Parkinson's law, with our inability to actually acquire capital, or how is it more dangerous than Willie Sutton, actually having your money directly stolen from you, or just when you have finally have acquired capital, how can you keep it? He says it's the most devastating. So what do you think before we even go on of how this is that?
I think part of it's because it's easier perhaps to overcome Parkinson's law or Willie Sutton's law. So, for example, if I'm spending too much money, at some point, if I'm living above my means, I'm going to feel that and I can take steps to correct that. Or if Willie Sutton's hand is in my pocket, I'm still going to feel the effects of that and I can figure out ways or means to mitigate that. But if I think that I already understand, I already know everything that there is to know, I stop listening, I stop learning. And Nelson says it plainly, we rot. And he says that in all caps. And so I was just thinking about the fact that he uses that term. That's this idea of decaying, declining, right? We're moving backwards. We're not even just stagnant when we stop learning. Next, Nelson is going to turn his attention to Ed Deming, and he refers to him. He says that wonderful business consultant who was still working at the age of 93. I think Nelson always liked that. He never liked the idea of retirement. He himself worked well into his 80s. He says he was the person who taught the Japanese the idea of quality. Business schools all over the country fell in love with his teachings after the Japanese showed the world the results. But shortly after World War II, Ed had started trying to get the attention of American businesses and teach them his ideas, but almost without exception, Ed ran into the response, "But we're already doing that." And Nelson says, no, they were not doing that. They were only taking a superficial look at what Ed was saying and jumping to the conclusion that they already understood all the ramifications of Ed's concepts. So let's just talk for a minute about Ed Deming.
Yeah, actually, it's pretty funny that he mentions Ed Deming at all, and then goes on to mention that business schools have fallen in love with him, because as soon as I saw his name, I laughed, because that was my entire senior year of business school, was pretty much learning about Ed Deming and, everything that he has done to affect manufacturing. And I actually took a class my senior year called Productivity, Quality, and Leadership, which is literally a class teaching you about lean manufacturing and business practices. And I actually got to learn quite a lot about him. And one thing that he kind of mentions this, that, the American manufacturers were saying we're already doing that. And a lot of the issue was that essentially all of the manufacturing competition in the world had been destroyed in World War II, which was Japan and Germany. So Germany was the primary other large manufacturer in the world. And so when that was knocked out, the United States had no competition. That's why the 50s was just this boom of an economy for the United States, was because we had zero competition in manufacturing. Everything had to come pretty much from the US. And so when he would go to the US manufacturers, they basically just thought that they had the best thing ever because look at the profits, look at how well they're doing, look at, quality American made goods. And so they didn't want to hear about how they could be better because they thought that they were already the best.
So they could actually kind of sit on their laurels and feel like they were doing just fine without anything from him. Right.
Correct. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Which goes on, which is funny because that later directly affects the decline of American manufacturing. And that actually opened the door for the Japanese to then be able to take on Ed's ideas and actually compete in the American market because they actually took his ideas seriously.
They just made some serious assumptions here, I guess. And so he goes on to say, Ed turned to Japan with an economy that was non-existent. They were flat on their backs, and he found a culture that already knew discipline and was willing to listen and do what he said. So very different mindset here. The rest is history, and American manufacturers paid the price with their arrogance. So there is that arrogance. We already know what we're doing. And even this idea that they just took a superficial look.
I just kind of put the connection in my head that with the arrival syndrome, it's this idea that we've got it all figured out. But with what Ed was teaching, one of the practices that came out of his teachings was called Kaizen events, which is essentially a continuous improvement event where all of your line workers, all of your managers kind of get together. And typically in Japanese manufacturing, and even now in the US, we've adopted all of this. Most manufacturers start every single day with one of these meetings where they basically look at what's happened the day before, what issues did we run into, what good things happened, etc. And then they look for ways to improve everything that occurred yesterday, right? So it's this idea of constant continuous improvement in all of the little things and all the big things. So you can never have the arrival syndrome if you practice this idea of I can always get better. I can always be 1% better,
Yeah, I love that. That's actually truly what we need to do. This is the opposite of the arrival syndrome. Instead, they jump to conclusions, but also just not willing to see all of the ramifications of what Ed was doing. And I think when it comes to the infinite banking concept, which I'm sure is where Nelson is really going with this, is that they take a cursory look at it and just blow it off because they're like, oh, I know about that. Or, or I've heard certain things about that. And so they just jump to those conclusions. Maybe they think it's a scam or whatever it might be, but they don't really take an in-depth look at it to consider it. Whereas I was looking at the Japanese here, and this is fascinating to me because there's like 4 things here. They're flat on their backs. They've been devastated by World War II. They have nowhere to go but up.
Yep.
They already have the discipline. And I was just thinking about that. That was kind of built into their culture for hundreds of years, is my understanding. And I thought this was fascinating. Even in elementary school, they don't just get served lunch or bring their lunch. They actually make their lunches. They participate in lunchtime, as well as cleaning up after themselves. And these things create an early sense of responsibility.
And actually, it's funny that you just talked about they're required to clean up after themselves. The World Cup's going on right now. And the Japanese fans are known because after every single game, they clean the stadium.
Look at that.
It's what they're known for. Win, lose, draw, it doesn't matter, rain, sun, or shine. They'll clean the entire stadium, and it's what they're known for. And they all do it.
So that's what Nelson's saying, that discipline was already there. They're flat on their backs. They're disciplined, but they were also willing to listen, not just hear it, but actually listen. There's a big difference there. And then take action. Do what Ed Deming actually said. So those 4 things are there. And as I was thinking about this, I thought that's exactly where Nelson was when he discovered this concept. He basically had those same exact characteristics. He was flat on his back, so to speak, in a crisis, devastated by the loss of a brother, a grandchild with cancer, way over leveraged in real estate, financially in serious trouble, but he was accustomed to paying large premiums. So he had that discipline already built in from a very early age. Nelson was paying premiums, I believe, as a teenage boy. He was also on his knees in prayer, searching for answers, willing to listen. and then he took the necessary action. So I think that's just a really good lesson for all of us. Those of us who come to the infinite banking concept, or perhaps anything that we want to learn, that's the attitude, which is the opposite of pride. It's humility. I'm coming in a place of learning and ready to take in that learning and do something with it. So Nelson in the text here goes on to mention Daniel Borstein, the historian. He stated it this way: the greatest obstacle to discovering the shape of the earth, the continents, and the oceans was not ignorance, it was the illusion of knowledge. So that is what is more dangerous. It's not just ignorance. It's what you think you know that just ain't so. That's actually the problem. It's all back to this rethinking your thinking.
There's actually in Plato's Apology, or there's a quote, and it's often misconstrued, but essentially paraphrasing it, Socrates says that he's the wisest among the Greek men because he knows that he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He doesn't think that he knows what he doesn't know. So a lot of people think that they know what they don't know, if that makes sense. So we've always, and I'm very guilty of this, I love to know. I love to have an answer. And so often we want to just have an answer rather than actually pausing, listening, and asking why.
Yes, you touched on it there. The more we know, the more we realize how much we don't know. And that's what actually leads to more wisdom, doesn't it? It's just in that humble state. And I think that's where true knowledge leads you to that posture.
As a practitioner trying to teach others about the infinite banking concept, or maybe bringing in new clients, what is your greatest obstacle to dealing with perhaps their arrival syndrome, and how might you help them overcome that perhaps?
Well, first of all, someone who has a serious case of the arrival syndrome probably doesn't come to me at all in the first place because their mind is closed to the concept. More often, what happens is when a couple comes to me and you'll have one husband or wife. Most recently, I've had wives that get it. They've read the book. They're super excited about it, but their husbands are skeptics. It can go the other way too. I've had it the opposite as well, but that's challenging because I want to answer the skeptic's questions as much as possible. But the reality is if that person has the arrival syndrome and they don't want to learn and they think they're right, they think they already know all there is to know, then it can feel like a bit of a fool's errand. And I would add that it's especially challenging if I've got a spouse who just absolutely refuses to read the book. They will come and they'll say, but I don't get it. What about this? And, what's the rate of return? And this is a scam or whatever. But then they absolutely refuse to read the book. Well, that just tells me they really don't want to know. And there is not much you can do for that. And I often feel very much for the other spouse. It always makes me pause a little bit because I don't like to have a situation where a husband and wife are at odds. So I do want to make sure that the other spouse is at least willing to entertain or allow the spouse to do what they want to do because it can create problems. For me, as a practitioner, that's how I see it the most because the person with complete arrival syndrome is not calling me anyways. I will do everything that I can for the sake of the spouse who wants to become their own banker to answer the skeptic's questions. But at the end of the day, they've got to want it for themselves. They really do. And let me just add this too. I've looked at people and they'll just say, I don't want to read the book. I'm like, it's a 92-page book. And if you follow my recommended reading strategy, we can get that down to about 50 pages. And by the way, there's a lot of white blank space in this book too. And to say all of that, this is not saying that everybody needs to learn everything there is to know about the infinite banking concept to the degree that a practitioner needs to understand it. But I will say, for me personally, nothing has taught me more about becoming my own banker than actually going through this book and actually having to teach it. Because when you teach something, it forces you to slow down and really say, wait a minute, what is he actually saying? Not just what I think he's saying or what I have kind of assumed that he's saying, but what is he really saying? And let me dig in because I now have to teach this to someone else. And so it's that slowing down and taking it in, but also it's just the posture of being in a place where I'm always willing to learn more. And so I just want to encourage you that way that we're always learning, always improving at Deming. So, okay, there's a second half to this sentence. He says the hardest job is to get people to open up their minds and take an in-depth look as to what's going on and correctly classify what is seen. Nelson has often said that, for example, a dividend-paying whole life insurance policy is incorrectly classified as life insurance with its emphasis on the death benefit. In fact, if you go to the glossary in the back, even there we learn from Nelson, he has classification listed. He says, classification is the act of grouping into classes that have systematic relations usually founded on common properties. You classify things on the basis of their major characteristics. Remember, he was a forester. So it was a lot about classifying trees and different things. A life insurance policy with a mutual dividend-paying company is a gross misclassification of a financial instrument. It has much more in common with the concept of banking. So if we were to look at the major characteristics, it would include a place to store wealth. You can leverage it, collateralize that death benefit. You can take loans. You can pay loans back. There's a compounding growth with interest and dividends. All of those are speaking to a financial instrument. So he's right. And oh, by the way, it also happens to have a death benefit. That's the cherry on top. But we have characterized the entire thing by the death benefit alone and completely lost all of the living benefits. So that's what he's getting at there when he says we have to help people correctly classify what it actually is. That can become a stumbling block to people because they've got it classified wrong in the first place.
Yeah, and I know that at the end of this section here of the arrival syndrome, he mentions that EVA article in Fortune magazine in September 1993. So that goes back to the economic value added that we talked about, where there's a cost to your capital. And he says, the quote from it, "If you understand what's really happening, you'll know what to do." Right? So that same idea of classification. If you truly understand what's actually in front of you and what is actually going on, you'll understand what to do.
And just to kind of help people that maybe didn't hear all of our conversation about EVA on a previous episode, this was at a time when American businesses, just like they did with Ed Deming, finally wake up to the fact that nowhere in their accounting practices on the spreadsheet did they ever account for the cost of their own capital. So they could have this illusion that they were making a profit. But once the managers understood that, oh, we had not been accounting for the cost of capital, because there's always a cost to your capital. It's costing you what it could have earned. That's that idea of paying cash still has a financing cost. So when they started to realize that and started to actually account for it, it forced them to become more efficient, which then increased their profitability for their stockholders, and their businesses started booming. So that article ends with, if you know what's happening, you'll know what to do. And once you realize that, it changes your calculations. Otherwise, you're just pretending to be profitable, but you're really not. Now, if we could just get individuals to realize that the same thing is true in your personal finance, you've got to understand what's truly happening. So
it requires you to ask the why, ask the questions, right? And to be truly aware of what's hidden and happening in front of you. So, yeah.
You have to be open-minded to be willing to think about those things, to ask those questions, to be willing to learn. This does beg the question, though, what is really happening in the financial world? I got to thinking about that when it ends with this here. So I was going through in my mind everything that Nelson has been telling us up to this point, what's really happening in the financial world that we haven't been thinking about. And he reminds us in the very beginning that there's really only one large pool of money. The fact that this pool is managed by a number of institutions, banks, insurance companies, corporations, individuals in various countries with various currencies is incidental. Eventually, along the way, some of it flows through you and me. So every one of us has money going through our own hands. This is happening, but most of it is flowing away from us. Large volumes of interest is flowing to banks. We talked about that in the problem section. And in that problem section, he didn't focus on it, but there was one little sentence that says, and if we pay cash, we're losing the opportunity cost of that cash.
Yeah, and money is leaving us this whole time through taxes flowing back up to the government. So you have Willie Sutton there. You have the crippling inflation that's just astronomically high right now, draining our purchasing power, in all these ways and more, and not considering our own spending. We do live in a very consumeristic society, and it's hard to get away from.
Right. So all of that takes our money in a direction that's going away from us. And then there's some other things happening that we talked about. Actually, we've mentioned it quite a bit in Willie Sutton's Law. We talked about these retirement accounts, or maybe we should say misclassified as retirement savings. There it is. What's happening there? What's really happening there?
Investing.
It's investing.
Yeah.
It's not savings. They're locking up our capital behind penalties and taxes during the years when we probably need access the most.
Yep.
So we have a lot of our money flowing away from us. The rest of the money, the little bit that we think we are saving, is locked up at risk of loss, paying fees, keeping our dollars out of our control. And it keeps us in this spending pattern. We're earning a little bit over here, but we're losing volumes of interest to banks because when we need the money, we can't touch that money. So we have to go run to the bank for capital, and we have to pay interest rates to them, whether that's 6-8% for a car, or whether that's 28% on a credit card, while we're thinking that we're doing well with our small percentage
if you get approved, right?
That's
Because
right.
it's their money, their rules. You require their permission. So now here you are waiting. So maybe you're going to miss out on some opportunity perhaps as well, right? You can't act on anything that might come across you as a good opportunity to make more money, right? So then you're further just sitting in that space of, well, if only I had the money to go and do that opportunity that just came across me, but I don't have it.
So all of these things are happening. Nelson, here he says, his quote says, if you understand what's really happening, you'll know what to do. This is what's happening, and you wonder why you can never get ahead. You wonder why all your efforts are not paying off. It's just exactly like my clients who said, I've done everything I was supposed to do. I did everything they have told us conventionally to do, and we still are not free. And yet, people will say, I already know everything there is to know about all of this. I'm not listening. Okay, so if this is what is really happening, what do we need to do? We need to be putting our money in a place that avoids taxation, that keeps up with inflation, that recapture that interest. Essentially, if we were to distill down the infinite banking concept in a very simple way, is that money's flowing away from us, and we want to turn that money around into a system where you own and control it. That's what the infinite banking concept does for us. So Nelson ends this whole chapter with a prayer and a scripture, and I think this is very interesting. Let's go ahead and read this last prayer, and I would just encourage our listeners to listen in on this carefully.
Okay. Disturb us, O Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we dream too little, when we arrive safely because we sail too close to the shore. Disturb us, O Lord, when with the abundance of things we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity, and in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heavens to dim. Disturb us, O Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas where storms will show your mastery. Where losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes, and to push us in the future in strength, courage, hope, and love. Then we ask in the name of our captain, who is Jesus Christ. Sir Francis Drake's prayers before he set out to be the first man to circumnavigate the world, Portsmouth, England, 1577.
Okay, so historically, Sir Francis Drake left Plymouth in 1577 with 6 ships and 164 crewmen. He returned 3 years later with 1 ship and 58 men. So obviously the odds of surviving his adventure were not very good. But this prayer stands as a wonderful challenge for all of us to dream big, to live with eternity in mind, to practice bold faith, to have courage, to go boldly. So when I read this, I actually think of these as a little bit of bookends, because he ends with a prayer and with a scripture. And the prayer is really telling us to wake up, disturb us, help us open our eyes, and help us dream big in order to live bigger than we might have been, to be willing to take the journey, to venture out into wider seas, it says. I think what he's getting at here is that this arrival syndrome, it can keep us in that place of complacency. We already know it. We don't need to do anything further. We don't need to have courage and boldness. We can just kind of like the American manufacturers sit on our laurels. We're good. But then he goes into the scripture verse at the end, and I'm going to read this one for you. It says, "You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord our God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your forefathers as it is today." Deuteronomy 8:17 and 18. It seemed to me the first time I read this, like, the scripture doesn't really seem to go with this prayer. And then I thought about it, and I thought, Nelson is actually warning us about pride at both ends of this thing. It's a double-edged sword. Think of it this way. With the arrival syndrome, pride can keep us from learning, can keep us from taking those adventures, traveling out to wider seas. But then when we do, it can show up after we begin to succeed. We can build that capital. We can gain control. We can begin to see differently. And our human hearts are so bent on our own destruction and our own wickedness. It says that my power and the strength of my hands produce this wealth for me. We can end up forgetting that it was the Lord our God who actually gave us the ability to produce the wealth. So we have to watch our human pride on either end, because it just seems to have the ability to pop its head up wherever we are. When I think of it, I think of, it can be the preacher in the pulpit preaching on humility and come away from the sermon saying, wow, what a great sermon I preached. Right? I mean, that's just the kind of thing. So having completed this chapter, Jonathan, I'm curious how this section might have challenged you. What would you say is your big takeaway from this section personally?
Well, the human problem section in general, it's called the human problem section for a reason. I'm a human, so they apply to me. And it was taking a hard look in the mirror. With Parkinson's law, I recently got promoted just over a year ago. I've been in my position with Worth as the outside sales rep here in North Carolina. And, I got a promotion, which meant I got a raise, and I found that my expenses pretty quickly matched my raise. And so I had to take a hard look at myself and set some parameters and set some, guidelines for myself to kind of get me back to where I needed to be. And then I'd say with this section the most, I am guilty as charged on the arrival syndrome. I love to know things. I love to have the answer to a fault, I will say, to the point where even if I don't know something, I will try to articulate what I think would be the answer. I would try to assume what I think might be the answer, or get to a point where I think I could figure out what an answer might be, rather than just being willing to say, wow, that's a great question. I don't know. I would rather try to figure out an answer than just saying I don't know. So I'm very guilty as charged, and I know that I need to practice slowing down, really absorbing a question, really digesting it. It's almost like we're always constantly under duress, or like fight or flight, right? Like we're always constantly like, gotta answer, this. So I think I have to learn to just slow down, pause, think, understand, and respond.
Yeah, I was going to say in that last part about wanting to always know the answer, you come by that very honest. The apple does not fall far from the tree. But I was going to add one thing that truly stuck with me in this chapter. It was after I really considered that verse in Deuteronomy, because even as I, want to say I don't have patience for somebody who won't read a 92-page book. I mean, quite frankly, that is challenging for me to have patience with, because I'm like, it's not that hard. Pick up the book. It'll take you an afternoon. At the same time, I have to realize that my top strength is the learner. That's who I am. Learning is wired into me. Okay. Learning is my jam. So it's very easy for me to just think, well, go learn this stuff, right? What's so hard? Well, that's who I am. So I do that. But it's also easy for me to forget that God wired me that way, and that I need to just be grateful, because quite frankly, if I hadn't been wired that way, to realize that God has made me a learner, I might never have learned the infinite banking concept myself. I might be the person not willing to read the book. So for me, it's like, humility on the other end. So 100%, we are all human and we all have these human foibles, and it is a lifetime of improvement, recognizing, seeing our own faults, kind of being able to maybe have other people help us with our blind spots and working on them, but being humble about that. I'm grateful that I did read the book. I'm grateful that the Lord took me there and clearly showed this to me And I am so grateful that he showed it to Nelson as well. So ultimately, the arrival syndrome is all about this human pride. We want to say, I already know all about it before I've really even listened. It misclassifies what I'm seeing because I don't want to slow down and look a little bit more carefully. And of course, as I just mentioned, pride can show up later after God has blessed the work of our hands, even after we maybe are willing to learn, and tempt us to believe that we did it all ourselves. So maybe the best place to end this episode is exactly where Nelson points us in prayer, saying, Lord, show me what I don't know that I think I already know, and then keep me humble when you do. And I also think it's very fitting that Nelson ends this section with this prayer, considering that the infinite banking concept was actually discovered on his knees in prayer at a time when he was desperately seeking wisdom in a posture of humility, looking to God for the answers in the awful circumstances that he found himself. So, any final thoughts, Jonathan, before we close?
Double the pride, double the fall. Just try to practice humility in all things we do, and I think it would go a long way in this world in general, I think.
To piggyback on that, if I could just share for a minute, I would just tell you that I am absolutely amazed at what God has done through the infinite banking concept in my life. God has done it, but it has been amazing to me how quickly he has turned my financial well-being, given me a purpose in life to teach other people to do this, to help them to be free. I absolutely could talk about that all day. But in closing, I want to just say this. If you have heard of the infinite banking concept before, maybe in passing, maybe you brushed it off as a scam, or maybe you're hearing about it now for the first time and it has you curious. Either way, I want to challenge you to stop assuming that you know about it as much as you think you do. Take some time to study and learn with an open mind. Ask good questions. Be curious. Stay humble. And read this book more than once. If you're willing to do that, when you're ready, reach out to me on my website at banklessbydesign.com, or you can email me at tricia@banklessbydesign.com. I would absolutely love to have a conversation with you and walk through what it might look like for you to become your own banker and to guide you along that journey. That is my favorite thing to do, is to watch the light bulbs go on when someone begins discovering the infinite banking concept. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. And until next time, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your week.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Bankless by Design podcast, where we're done with the system and we're doing money differently. Be sure to subscribe, share this episode with someone who needs it, and visit us at banklessbydesign.com to learn how you can start living bankless by design.